If you're Latin American, chances are you probably know this song. It's the opening song that starts an episode of a 70s Mexican sitcom, El Chavo del Ocho, translated in English as The Kid from the Eighth. El Chavo del Ocho was created by Mexican writer and actor Roberto Bolaños, and upon his death in 2014, tens of thousands of Mexicans would take up the streets and mourn him. The President of Mexico mourned his death, calling him an icon whose work transcended generations and borders. I still remember growing up, my family had a small square black and white TV that had a VHS player built into it. On this television, we watched so many episodes of El Chavo del Ocho and some of his other shows that my dad had brought with him on tapes from Peru. And if you're a Latin American that's around my age, you probably watched it that way as well, together with your parents. From Peru to Argentina to Chile to Uruguay and of course to Mexico, the comedy of Roberto Gómez Bolaños has made generations of Latin Americans laugh. But how did one comedian get to such a status throughout such a huge part of the world and ingrain himself so deeply in Latin American culture? Roberto Gómez Bolaños was born in Mexico City, Mexico, in 1929, the middle child of 3 boys. As a young man, he had some mild success as a boxer, but his height prevented him from ever pursuing it professionally. He studied engineering in university and, realizing it wasn't for him, started working as a writer in a marketing agency. He would soon transition to writing scripts for radio and television and would land a job as a writer for Mexican comedy shows. Here, his dedication as a writer would shine, and his quality as well as the amount of work he produced earned him the nickname that he would stick with for the rest of his life. Chespirito, or in English, Little Shakespeare. After half a decade of working as a writer for television, he got the chance at writing and acting in his own show, a 30-minute sketch comedy titled Chespirito, where Bolaños would act as various different characters depending on the skit. The show would run on Saturdays, but after it became a massive hit with adults and children alike, the show would be moved to Monday, and Chespirito would be given a full hour. The show would continue this way for 5 years until 1973, where 2 of his most well-liked characters were given their own weekly 30-minute sitcoms. The first of these characters was a superhero in a red costume called El Chapulín Colorado, translated in English as the Crimson Grasshopper. The show consisted of the titular character, a dumb but well-meaning superhero, and his arsenal of tools, from a pill that makes you shrink to an inflatable hammer, as he tries to help whoever it is that needs his help this week.
Oh, y ahora, ¿quién podrá ayudarnos? ¡Ay, ya no sé! ¡Yo! ¡El Chapulín Colorado! ¡No contaban con mi ¿qué pasó acá!
It's a funny show, and El Chapulin's costume is instantly iconic. In fact, the creator of The Simpsons, Matt Groening, created the character of Bumblebee Man after watching a couple episodes of El Chapulín at a motel near the US-Mexican border. But without a doubt, the character that made Chespirito famous throughout all of Latin America has got to be El Chavo del Ocho. El Chavo del Ocho, or translated as The Kid from the Eighth, was a sitcom following the daily lives of the inhabitants of one neighborhood. The titular Chavo, a poor 8-year-old orphan who hangs out and sleeps in a barrel in the middle of the neighborhood, is played by Chespirito himself. But El Chavo wasn't just great because of that character, but because of all the characters that were part of the neighborhood, all played by actors who would become instantly recognizable throughout Latin America. Florinda Mesa would play Doña Florinda, an uptight middle-class neighbor who thought herself better than the other inhabitants of the neighborhood. Carlos Villagrán would play Kiko, her son, a spoiled boy who always rubs his new toys and candies in El Chavo's face. Ramon Valdez would play Don Ramon, an unemployed laborer who is a year behind on rent and is barely scraping by, and his daughter La Chilindrina would be played by María Antonieta de las Nieves. Rounding out the cast would be Rubén Aguilera, who would play Profesor Girafales, the teacher at the elementary school the students attend and romantic partner of Doña Florinda, Edgar Vivar as Señor Barriga or Mr. Belly in English, the landlord of the neighborhood they all lived in, and Angelinas Fernandez as Doña Clotilda, an older woman who lives alone and is called a witch by the neighborhood kids. These 8 actors and characters would form the base of El Chavo del Ocho's hundreds of episodes. It's difficult to describe just how popular this show was while it was running. In the mid-1970s, it was estimated that over 50% of televisions in Mexico were tuned into new episodes of El Chavo. The average episode drew in over 300 million viewers weekly throughout Latin America. That's more than twice the viewership of an average Super Bowl every single week. I read an interesting essay about El Chavo that I'll link in the description for you to read yourself, written by David González Hernández, that touches on reasons why El Chavo resonated so deeply with Latin Americans. So I wanted to give him credit for his ideas that I'm about to present to you in this next little bit. He writes that whereas American sitcoms focus on close-knit groups of people like families, friends, or workplaces, the heart of Mexican and Latin American sitcoms started with the neighborhood. While designing the show, Chespirito tapped into something extremely culturally relevant to most Latin Americans and designed a show around the acknowledgement but not the criticism of a lot of issues throughout Latin America. El Chavo started with a simple sketch that Bolaños had envisioned for his other sketch comedy show, Chespirito. A poor but well-meaning orphan is looking for a sandwich to eat when he gets into a brief argument with a balloon salesman. From there, the idea of other characters for this boy to interact with came to light. His 2 child friends were made to be different from El Chavo but still reflect reality. La Chilindrina would be the smart but mischievous girl who's always getting in trouble, and Kiko would be El Chavo's opposite, a selfish kid who likes to flaunt his toys. To justify these 2 kids, Chespirito would have to create the parents, Don Ramon and Doña Florinda, one an unemployed and kind of crazy parent who still has no problem hitting the kids, and the other a single mother who is barely scraping by, but still somehow constantly thinks of herself and her son as better than the others in the neighborhood. But despite all the characters' flaws, every character does their best to contribute to the neighborhood. Don Ramon, despite trying his very hardest not to work, does feed El Chavo, despite both of them being poor. Even Señor Barriga, the landlord, is shown to be kind at times and hasn't thrown out Don Ramon even after a year of unpaid rent. If only all landlords were as forgiving as Señor Barriga. In addition to the characters, the tiny neighborhood and the courtyard that almost the entirety of the series takes place in was also equally important. Most Latin Americans at the time lived in homes like those. They were both more affordable and easily accessible. Because of how they were built, and because most of the people that lived in them were usually poor, families got to know and relied on each other. In these neighborhoods, the coexistence between families was a part of everyday life, children playing in the shared patio and women usually in the wash house. If we consider the neighborhood as one of those community spaces generating collective ideological cohesion and creation of joint identification of its inhabitants around the physical area that responds to the social condition of its individuals and the crossing of values, then we can observe the function of the central patio as a place of coexistence and daily activities. The neighborhood was a reflection of how most Latin Americans lived, and in El Chavo it looked familiar and comfortable. The doors and windows were left open, and the people, for all their disagreements, had a place in this little community. Like everything though, the show's massive popularity couldn't last forever. After 8 seasons on the air, and after some cast members had begun to move on to other projects, El Chavo was cancelled in 1980. Afterwards, he would revive his earlier sketch comedy show, Chespirito, and continue writing and acting for a few more years before eventually retiring from acting in the mid-90s, although he did act in a few plays into the early 2000s. He would eventually remarry to Florinda Mesa, one of his longtime co-stars on El Chavo, and here's where I have to start talking about some of the controversies he was involved in. When Florinda Mesa and Roberto Bolaños started dating, he was already married to someone he had 6 kids with. On top of this, Florinda Mesa was also involved with other cast members and crew members that worked on El Chavo, most well known of which was probably Carlos Villagrán, the actor who played her character's son. Bolaños was actually involved in a couple of legal conflicts throughout and after El Chavo's runtime with both Villagrán and De las Nieves over the ownership of the respective characters they portrayed in the show. He's also been criticized politically as he was a strong opponent of abortion rights in Mexico as well as a vocal supporter of the National Action Party, a right-wing Christian conservative party.
Hola, soy su amigo Chespirito. Cuando estaba yo en el vientre de mi madre, ella sufrió un accidente que la puso al borde de la muerte. El médico le dijo, tendrás que abortar. Y ella respondió, abortar yo jamás. Es decir, defendió la vida, mi vida. Y gracias a ello estoy aquí.
During the years El Chavo was on the air, he was also criticized for the tours he went on with his cast throughout Latin America, especially for visiting both Argentina and Chile, which were both under military dictatorships, even visiting the Chilean National Stadium only 5 years after it had been used as a concentration camp by the same person who was still running the country. His comedy has also been a source of criticism in recent years, as a lot of the humor in El Chavo and his other sketch comedies haven't aged well. For example, a lot of the jokes the characters make towards one another is based on physical appearance and especially weight, as the two overweight characters in the show, both played by the same actor, are constantly referred to or made fun of because of their weight. More problematic than that, though, was the use of the physical violence in the show. Although the sitcom was a slapstick comedy, there were a lot of instances of violence that could parallel real life, like when Don Ramon would hit the neighborhood kids. And he would hit them a lot. Even through Chespirito's legacy, it's important to talk about who he was as a person so we can get a better understanding of who he was not just as Chespirito, but as Roberto Bolaños. And it's also important to discuss how his work can reflect the time period he existed during, even if how we look at certain parts of that time period have changed. Chespirito would eventually die of heart failure in November 2014 at the age of 85. Fans of his work came out in droves to honor him and the characters that he brought to life, and to remember a person who brought together generations of Latin American families in front of their television sets. To this day, there are still animated sequels of both El Chavo and El Chapulín, but none of them have reached the level that he and his original series have, all the way back in the 70s.